G'day, legends. I hope that you are having a fantastic day. And so far, well, I'm releasing this on a Friday, so a great end to your week. But I have an expert here with me, and something I've really wanted to speak about, but is somewhat outside of my wheelhouse, is about what we are seeing occur in Venezuela. So, Mr. Sino Talk, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
You're welcome, Matt. I appreciate you reaching out and to have me on. I really do appreciate it.
Man, can you just give us a quick breakdown, I guess, of who you are? Now, we are hiding your identity for now, but in the future, we will be doing more face-to-face and public. But can you just give a quick explanation to who you are to our listeners?
Yeah, so my name is Joaquin Camarena. I run Talk. I publish all of his articles, anything that's on there. It's come from my brain thinking house, aka my brain. So I mainly focus upon the PLA modernization, anything regarding, how they are building out their, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Rocket Force, or anything more high level. But I tend to focus upon the more tactical and operational aspect because very few people have the ability to talk about it, and also on some aspects don't really care about that because they care more about the strategic level, like nuclear missiles, or changes within the PLA itself. But the tactical level is just as important because the last 500 yards are going to be closing out with those Lance Corporals and PFCs and specialists, and they need to know a lot of information about the PLA, and I'm hoping to bridge that gap. And then I'll also discuss some of the stuff about the CCP, their more nefarious dealings, in which we're probably going to be talking about that somewhat with Venezuela and China's relationship, which is really interesting because a lot of people don't really realize how deep China does, or how deep it goes with China, with not only Venezuela but with other countries as well.
Yeah, and that's what we were just going to do today. Is you and I aren't going to do a full breakdown of this or that. What we're going to do is really focus and look into Venezuela. As, of course, you've seen, and everyone will have seen, that Venezuela has been across the world. Social and mainstream media following US President Donald Trump has been posting on his social medias kinetic strikes against alleged drug smugglers, alongside a lot of claims as well about President Nicolas Maduro's involvement in cartels. And we've seen the US deploy a lot of forces into that region, and it seems to be setting the stage for further kinetic action or even to regime change. So we're going to speak a bit about that. And it's very interesting where you talk about you more focus on like frontline battlefield, tactical level parts on your primary is your Instagram. That's linked below. Sino Talk is fantastic. But the reason why that is so important, and so many people focus just on strategy, is on my channel a lot. People will hear me talk about that war. You need to have a holistic view of war, that tactics develop operational victories on the battlefield. Operational victories on the battlefield can develop then strategic gains, and strategic gains then that can influence political change, as war is just a hard-nosed, blunt force tool of politics if you follow sort of the Clausewitzian idea of that. Do you think that's a fair assessment of where the US and Venezuela have tension at the moment?
I think so, or at least to an extent, because between the United States and Venezuela, it's more of tensions are at a head regarding their long-standing disputes. This isn't new. So with all this started around the early 2000s, you can maybe even justify in stating that it happened whenever Hugo Chavez was elected in 1999. But it really ramped up during Hugo Chavez's presidency, whenever he said we're going to pivot to countries not not the United States or the West. So this is why you've seen him pivoting, to Russia, South Africa, Brazil, but you've seen this really big pivot to China specifically because he kind of his viewpoint is that the Bolivarian Revolution and the Chinese Maoist Revolution are kindred spirits, if you will. That he even went on record whenever he was whenever he was in China, and he gave a speech at a university. I believe it was Renmin University, where he said that Mao and Simon Boulevard are kindred spirits. They're soulmates, which is kind of an interesting aspect because one was a somewhat wealthy owner, the son of a somewhat wealthy owner, and the other one was Simon Boulevard, I believe he was an aristocrat, and you kind of chuckle when you hear that, but it's really just him trying to live up to, hey, I want to develop this relationship between our two countries because I don't like the United States. They're the Western Yankees, always influencing or interfering with my country's politics or society, and we want to do more with you. And so that actually continued until he died from cancer, I believe in 2012 or 2013. And then you've seen it accelerate with Maduro, because at that point, you had the oil industry collapse because of the rampant brain drain, cronyism, other forms of corruption, and that only led to Venezuela pivoting more towards China, and which China was more than happy to accept it because they need a foothold in Latin America or the United States backyard, if you will, and Venezuela would be the best one out of all of them.
Yeah, you said to me off air, you said that they have a very deep, very lopsided relationship. Can you just break down where China and Venezuela's relationship sits? Is it around resources? Is it politics? Is it weapons? Where is it?
It would be mostly economic resources and diplomatic. So I mentioned earlier, the oil aspect of it, or the hinted at it. Venezuela and China have a very close relationship regarding oil. I believe they get 90% of their oil from Venezuela. But the only real problem with it is that China actually has to process it, refine it in an entirely new process because it's different what they usually have, which is more light, crude. You don't really have to refine it as much. In which compared that to Venezuela's sulfurous, very viscous. It's very hard to pump without special processes or special tools. You see them doing that, and you see them trying to that was a limitation, but now with Venezuela and China, or now with China actually investing into the Venezuela's oil industry, you kind of would. I think we're going to see a new revival of Venezuela's oil industry to an limited extent. It won't be a full revival because China knows better than to put all its chips in with China or with Venezuela, with a country like Venezuela. And then so diplomatically, you've seen Maduro, especially under Maduro, come out and say we support China on the global governance. One second. The global governance initiatives and the other initiatives that China has to either supplant the United States led order, or totally or outright replace it, in which they've said we support this because it's an alternative to the United States, and we know that China will not interfere with another country's internal affairs. just don't look at Myanmar, Laos, and Venezuela and all the other countries. Just don't look at that. And then they also signed on to supporting China's Hong Kong's national security law that China actually imposed upon the city state. And not only that, but you've seen them come to Venezuela's defense. And so during the whole process, ramping up tensions, the United States deploying, vessels, aircraft all around Venezuela, you've seen them, come to Venezuela's defense, saying that, hey, this is illegal. You can't just bomb people. You can't just do this. You have to let Venezuela decide their internal affairs, which is funny because, for all its actions, all of its statements, all of its, investing into, Venezuela's oil industry and Venezuela, essentially putting all of its chips into whatever China is promoting. You see the limits of that. You very much see the limits of how deep their relationship goes, or how far or how willing China is willing to help them.
So, from your perspective, when you're looking across and you're saying that it looks like to everyone the US is setting up for another regime change, and we have, of course, a very well documented history of regime changes carried out by the US with not the greatest track record. But do you see this more as the US trying to, as Trump may put it, as trying to get a hold on drugs and smuggling and people smuggling? Do you see it more as that, or do you see that the US is trying to gain power over a nation of which is moving in the direction or has massive trade with America's greatest competitor at the moment, as we see and have seen China rise over the past decades? Because there's little bits and pieces in this that scream in a different way, but philosophically the same, of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you see it a bit of column A, bit of column B, more strategic, or more on the US trying to lock down on this smuggling activity?
I think it's just the United States locking down its smuggling activity, and they just saw Venezuela as the most convenient punching bag, if you will, for them to do this with. Because and not only that, but Venezuela just so happens to be one of China's top partners in Latin America, or the top partner in Latin America. So it's just kind of a colliding of circumstances to create the situation. Now,
did you say it was 90% of Chinese oil?
I believe, or 90% of Venezuela's oil, I believe.
Oh, sorry. Yes. So yeah, 90% of what they export is going to China. Is that the correct metric?
I believe so.
Do you know how much that would be in like a dollar figure, or how much of China's total oil import that would be? Just trying to get an idea on like the severity of, if there is regime change, how much it's going to impact China, and I guess their own energy independence and sovereignty also.
So the total amount would be 1.6 billion USD. This is for 2024, and they do actually import more than 90%. And so I think it will hurt China, but then also it will force them to accelerate or continue on their great pivot towards green energy. Just ignore the massive amount of coal fire power plants that they're building, because they technically don't need the oil. They can get the oil from the Middle East, any of the Southeast Asian countries that still produce it.
Yeah,
Uh,
of course, you've got Russia sitting there. You've got, I know, Iran
exactly,
is a massive exporter as well. To
exactly, exactly. So they don't technically need the oil. They would be fine without it. It would actually hurt Venezuela more because one, they're going to be cutting off the oil, and then two, any infrastructure, any you know, any revitalization of this would take decades, if not more. And so for China, in a weird way, it would be the United States helping them wash their hands of a strategic source that, while yeah, it's a nice to have. While yes, it's a strategic source, it's a nice to have for them. They won't really lose any sleep if they were to just be suddenly cut off from it.
Right. So you don't see that China would be too concerned about losing, I guess, that arm of influence into Latin America and that region of the world?
I would say there would be more concern about losing an ally, a diplomatic political ally like Maduro, because anything that comes out of it would be more than likely be pro-American or be neutral to United States, having a relationship with the United States and the West, and possibly be, indifferent or perhaps even hostile to China. Just look at Argentina with Milani. He was voted in. He still is to an extent very anti-China, but he's very much pro-United States. He's very much pro-West. A night and day difference from the previous government that he replaced.
Do you think that we could see, if the US have some level of kinetic action, do you think that we could see like gray zone support for China to maintain this arm of power? I'm not saying therefore it's going to be, Chinese kinetic strike, but a sort of somewhat proxy or help in some way to not only maintain that strategic arm and that diplomatic arm, but potentially even the sovereignty and independence of that oil involvement also?
I don't think so. I mean, at the very least of it, and this kind of goes back to my statement about showing the limitations of this relationship. All throughout all of this increased tension, everything between the United States and Venezuela, you've seen China always reacting how they usually do, issuing out statements saying, hey guys, this is bad. Could you not do this? United States, you need to, abide by the, so-called international rules that the Chinese themselves are very hypocritical at not following sometimes. And, they turn to the Venezuelans, you did nothing wrong, my child. They give them a little pat on the head and like give them some plantains, and, they plantain slices, and, say, go ahead and go continue and be the righteous liberators. And by the and then for all that, everything that happened, China or the United States still continues to build up its military force, conduct, these kinetic strikes against, alleged, unalleged drug traffickers that come out of Venezuela. And that's despite China coming out and saying all these statements. It just shows you that, despite what some people say, Venezuela having a security under China's security umbrella, you don't really see that. I mean, whenever a country is under a security umbrella, you kind of would hope for a stronger response than a strongly or somewhat strongly worded essay from the government. But with China, you don't really, with China, that's all you get. So I don't think we'll see China full-heartedly enter like anything, like a proxy war, but they will exploit this situation to maximize its goals within the global south. Disinformation ops, misinformation ops, saying playing their foreign affairs and overseas Chinese associations playing this up, saying that look at what happened in Venezuela, like they were doing these things against the United States. The United States is evil, and so on, and you should really be China's friend, despite China itself showing that there's not really many security benefits to that.
Yeah, do you think that China, if they don't come to some sort of defensive aid here in some way, that idea of the Chinese security umbrella to some degree, the rhetoric of that does get weakened, much as other statements about security, say maybe for Ukraine from the US or the UK or Europe, etc., can set a precedent of when you don't have a firm response. But of course, we need to add nuance to that of saying you're dealing with two great state powers, and that this can spiral incredibly quickly, and they're sort of playing on the ultimate seesaw.
I don't think China will lose any credible security pacts, because what a lot of people don't remember or seem to forget is that China doesn't really like security alliances. So to give you a point of reference, and I always like to tell people this, China's only ally is North Korea. It's written in paper, it's like what we have with the South Koreans, saying that we will mutually defend you if this happens. We will help you. Despite them having this, look at what North Korea is. Look what they did all throughout history. And so from that lens, so for China viewing security lenses through that lens, they kind of like, do we really need like security alliances like the United States does, or do we have what it likes to call all-weather friends with Pakistan, which for all intents and purposes, that will be the closest analog to what they would like to have regarding security guarantees or security relationships. You could kind of look at it like you could probably throw in Myanmar as well, but I would like to limit that, because Myanmar is almost like North Korea in how they view outside entities. So I don't think China would lose any rep or credibility regarding their security umbrella. Now, if they were to sign like some type of treaty, if they have it like enforced, then yes, then there is some risk. But any security umbrella that they might have between, Venezuela and China, it's not really set in stone. So really, China really risks nothing. They could just wash their hands of this and we'll pick up the pieces where we got off and where we left off, and hopefully our interests will be taken care of or emphasized by the new government.
You speak about credibility in this, and both gaining and losing hard and soft power around the globe. How would something like this, do you believe, maybe affect US credibility in many corners of the globe, including our own corners of the globe domestically in Australia and the US and the UK and in Europe, that people see America as a world police that sits outside of their own rules-based order, from everything from overthrowing governments to sitting outside of these claimed rules and the hypocrisy of that. Do you think that this, if there is further kinetic actions in here, can damage US credibility, therefore leave a power vacuum for another great state then to gain in that credibility? Because I think, in my opinion, as far as soft power goes, the net change of soft power doesn't increase or decrease. It just shifts between the great state players or institutions. Do you think the US could damage themselves in this, what looks like a pretty weak argument for an overthrow at the moment. Like there's no threat to the US survival from this.
I think there has been some credibility damage with the United States, and you do bring up a good point, Matt, because this has actually, from my perspective, has damaged United States credibility. Now, this kind of goes back to what I mentioned about, this information ops, China's willingness to utilize this to show that, hey, we won't do this. That's, if China were to respond, that's how it will respond, because they view any situation, any escalatory crisis as, how can we milk this for our benefit? So for them, they see this as, hey, we would like to exploit this. And we can exploit this by showing how, the United States under Trump is disregarding the rules-based order, whereas we're trying to defend it ostensibly. Look at what they're doing with poor Venezuela. They're bombing people. They're, trying to do unilateral regime change, even if they're not trying to do it. They can still play upon that, highly emotional, highly historical strings of past instances when the United States has done that to not only Venezuela, but with literally every country within Latin America, to include Mexico. So I think China would see some shifting in its favor regarding soft power, but it would be extremely limited, because people will look at it and say, well, you didn't really help with Venezuela, at least the people who are smart enough to read, the news and understand China's actual position on this, or actually pay attention to it, I should say. So I think there will be some shifting to China's favor, but it would be a very limited and measured shifting of soft power. Regarding hard power, I don't think so. If anything, I would see that swinging in the United States, because for one, Trump just showed his willingness to, bomb, alleged drug traffickers off the coast of Venezuela. He's willing to send planes into their airspace. He's willing to send a large portion of the U.S. Navy to sit off of Venezuela's coast. What does that say to any other country out there who would want to go against the United States, whether it be perceived or actual? Or even if even if Donald Trump and his administration perceives it as such. And so I think, going back to Australia, I think some people within the current administration would probably be scratching their heads and asking themselves, does this apply to them as well, regarding whether or not the United States will help in any type of crisis? Because, Australia, from what I understand, also suffers from drug trafficking, not as much as the United States, but it still does suffer.
So it is huge here. Yeah, people don't realize how, I think per capita, I believe we are one of, if not the highest for cocaine, at least in Sydney. I think we're incredibly high in it, and there's a lot of trafficking comes through the states to our north. Down in, it's just not as publicly reported as in America.
Yeah. And so I think that's going to be, some of the current administration's thought process is that, if we play our cards right, maybe there's a remote chance that, Trump would lob a hairfire missile at some of these people who, are operating off of Australia's coast. But then again, there's also a possibility that Trump would just say, well, shit out of luck. It sounds like a Australia problem. And so Australia needs to figure itself out. So
Do you
it's
ever
like
get concerned about US overextension in this, as far as the US is a great state power and a regional hegemon. But the thing is, being that they have a lot of fingers in a lot of pies, and what can they bring to bear in one area of the world when they've got forces absolutely everywhere? So the US has forces from in Australia. They have forces sitting off the coast of Venezuela. They've got massive amount of forces in the Middle East. They've got large forces in Europe. They've got a large amount of forces everywhere. Is there ever concern that you see about the problem is to bring forces to bear in one theatre at one point in time? You've got all this everywhere else, and if you start pulling forces out of Australia to go to Europe, then it leaves Australia vulnerable. You start doing vice versa. You start pulling out the Middle East. Do you think that this could risk further extension of the US's already somewhat extended forces?
I do think it could. It just depends upon how. It would depend upon a couple of factors. The first one, and I would think this is the most important one, is what type of crisis it is, and so, or how it's perceived in the eyes of the Trump administration. Because during the during the conflict between Israel and Iran, you've seen Donald Trump and the Trump administration has moved a lot of forces from the Indo-Pacific to defend Israel. So there was a really, really valid concern about, did we just overextend ourselves? Going back to your what you mentioned in the question, is that, did we overextend ourselves? And I don't think we kind of did on anti-ballistic missile defense, because we pivoted a lot of that stuff to Israel to defend itself, to help defend it from Iran. Now, regarding naval capability, naval and aviation capability, you kind of seen that to a lesser extent, but overall, it didn't really hurt. It didn't really hurt the Indo-Pacific, or at least not in the long term, because all those assets can be redeployed back at any time, and I do believe some of them have. So I don't think there would be a long-term issue regarding this, because the standoff, if you will, would end. It will end eventually. Now, the real problem is, and this kind of goes back to your point. This kind of it kind of adds validity to your point about overextension. Have we overextended ourselves regarding missile capability? Do we have, or not missile capability, missile ammunition capability? Do we have enough PAC-3s, SF-6s, THAADs to be able to rapidly resupply these units? And so that was like an issue. It still is an ongoing issue from what I understand. As a matter of fact, we actually had to ask Japan to help out in the building out more of those missiles, or at least for PACs, so that we can actually rearm ourselves, let alone keep rearming Ukraine and other countries who also supply those missiles to Ukraine.
Yeah, that's been a huge, huge concern. I know I've read a lot. I think the New York Times has done a fair bit on this about air defense interceptors, and looking at how many Israel actually used, or at least how many it seems like they used, how many Ukraine is using, and where that may be leaving very open spots in other areas that would not just have the numerical ability to intercept any sort of larger missile threat. And this is one of the things I think of. America military power is massive, but when you say, yes, China has one ally and it's North Korea, they've sort of got all their eggs in that area of the world, where the US seems to have them absolutely everywhere, fingers in so many pies, that when you pull somewhere, it pushes somewhere else, that there's an equal and opposite reaction to this, and you could end up with further vulnerabilities. And just down to Venezuela again, just how this looks on the global scale, I think, is very, very important. So how it looks with Trump, then showing this footage that doesn't show, it's definitely not beyond reasonable doubt that these are people smuggling drugs. It is at the end of the day, it was guilty as charged to the executioner from drone footage and alleged ideas. Now, I'm not saying that it was or it wasn't, but what I'm saying is I think that this informational style war and how this can be exploited and how this looks to many, many other nations, whether it be in Latin America, whether it be in Indo-Pacific, whether it be in the Middle East, that the US is and has been over the last 20 years from, well, more than this, but I'll go over the last 20 years with these interventionist style policies working more as a missionary of ideas, that we do see a reduction in that power, and that reduction is leading to an increase for other states, especially as the US is threatening their relationships even into Europe. And I'm not saying therefore this exact scenario, but I'm saying that there is, J.D. Vance at the Munich, that speech he did in Munich, speaking about we're on different paths of democracy and this and this. It does seem like America is going more isolationist while still having to maintain a finger in every region of the world, which does lead to some concern.
I would agree with you regarding, the potential for the United States to, cause a lot of concern with its allies, especially regarding J.D. Vance's comments at the Munich Security Conference, in which, from what I understand, the room went silent because a lot of people were like, "What?
Yeah, dude.
What did he just say?"
Yeah.
I beg your finest pardon, Mr. Vice President.
Yeah.
But I would like to remind people, and this kind of goes back, to China's point, is that, every 4 years is an election. We change administrations. So this administration right now is currently on a semi-isolationist track with some tendencies of wanting to create spheres of influence for itself, as well as sprinkling in some transactional diplomacy as well. Now, that will change depending upon how the 2026 and 2028 elections go. It can go either way. One, it could be like more United States can actually become fully isolated like it did in the 1930s, or it can go a full 180 to where, like, okay, guys, we had a terrible, quote unquote, past 4 years. We're back now. We're going to be a responsible entity, and we will help you guys, and we will treat you as equals. We won't talk down to you anymore. We won't make any comments demeaning you, or any actions to do so as well. But I would say right now, there would be some concern with allies regarding, hey, is the United States is going to go back? And one thing is the United States going to be isolationist? I don't think it will, or at least not within these 4 years, because no matter what, Trump isn't stupid enough to believe that the United States can be fully isolationist. He's not. Many people like to say that he's an idiot for the things he do, for the things he says. He's not. He's not. He actually understands that, for all of his rhetoric, he has to reach out to countries to actually promote these deals, or to, get, quote unquote, better tariffs for the United States, or get a better deal, if you will. And so you can't really do that when you're totally isolated from those countries. Now, I don't think, now going back to the potential for the United States to be seen as a potentially interventionist power, I don't think they will be seen. I don't think any of that will be seen or will be changed with this current spat between the United States and Venezuela. Even if it does somehow happen that the United States goes in, we do a regime change, there will always be people who will say, like, well, let's look at the United States with its, imperialistic warmongering powers, on Instagram, X, LinkedIn, whatever have you. At the end of the day, it will, at the end of the day, and I like this question because it got me thinking. At the end of the day, I don't think most countries will see the United States as an imperialistic power, more so as the ones who actually do view us from that lens. So you have, you have the Brazils of, I forgot how to speak, Loa's Brazil, most of Africa to an extent, some parts of the Indo-Pacific. We will still be seen as the imperialistic oppressors to those countries. However, some would view it as a more of a nuanced lens, like in Europe or in Australia, or maybe and in New Zealand, that say, yes, the United States did go in and do regime change. Yes, they did do this. Did it cause harm to did it cause a lot of harm to the citizens of Venezuela? Yes. Did a lot of them die? Yes. However, was it for the greater good? It's almost like a utilitarian approach, if you will. That yes, they did these bad things, but for the good that it did, or potentially could do, outweighs the means, or justify the means.
That's assuming success, though, too. Like, we have so many examples of US intervention, whether by hard or soft means, that has turned a state which may be radical but may be more stable into just an absolute catastrophe for years and decades following. Also, and I know, as a not American from the outside looking in, it looks to me as like every time you try and do this, it just ends up in a far worse position by trying to export your ideas of ideology, of politics, of economics, by trying to do this to people who are not wanting to adapt this as far. We end up with these, instead of having a rogue but semi-stable state, you end up with a rogue, out of control state, and you see this again and again, that it's through hard power rather than seduction through to these changes that we're assuming there's going to be success, and that Venezuela is going to be bettered by this. And the concern for, like, Australians is that we look across and go, yeah, but is it that? Like, you may be heading into this rationally thinking, and yes, okay, there's going to be people die, it's going to happen, but it's for the greater good. That it may enter with that, but history shows, but is it going to be that? And I'm a believer of that great state players are rational actors, but you end up with, as soon as shots are fired, you don't know where this will actually go as nationalism, which can be, of course, reinforced by an interventionist power, that nationalism can form large resistance internally too, and then you don't know where this actually goes.
No, I understand, and that's why I was kind of guarded with my response,
Mm,
because you do bring up a good point where, a lot of people, from the outside United States, they bring up like the what if, like what if, whatever happens, what what if, the entity that replaces Venezuela is worse than what it replaced. There's always a there's always that point of there's always that point, and I think regarding that, it would be very. And I think one thing that the Trump administration, or at least some officials within the Trump administration, have argued is that they probably argued that exact point, is that, hey, what if we do this? I mean, will it cause issue? It will likely cause issues. Will it cause issues to Colombia? Will it cause issues to Guyana? Will it cause issues to Brazil? And regarding those three countries, they're not the most stable, and then two, they're not the most welcoming to Venezuelans. I think Guyana used to be the exception. Now they kind of not, because of the whole like we want because of the whole like half of Venezuela, because of Venezuela, looking at the country saying we want half your land, half of it was originally Venezuela's, so we want it back, please. But that all changed, and so I think some within the administration actually has thought about this, and I don't think we would, and I think we would tread very carefully regarding this, despite what a lot of people think about uh, how Trump makes his decisions.
mm,
I think he will be cognizant of the second and third order effects of what might happen if he does order a regime change. But then also, on the flip side, he also understands that, hey, if I do this correctly, my name would be remembered as the person who saved Venezuela. So the duality of Trump, if you will, um, would be used to make that decision.
mm. Well, Mr. Sino Talk, I think we've given a pretty in-depth vision of America's outlook, Chinese outlook towards this area of the world, and gone into a little bit of policy as well. Mate, is there any final things about China Venezuela's relationship that you think that we have missed in this?
I would say it's military relationship. I know we kind of hinted at it, and I downplayed it, but if China plays its cards well, and if Venezuela, and nothing happens to Venezuela to where regime change or increased sanctions would happen, I would not be too surprised if China uses this as a way to position itself to sell more advanced weaponry to Venezuela. Like the J-10 CE that was made famous by shooting down allegedly 6 Indian Air Force aircraft, including the Rafael.
Yes.
Include more advanced SAM systems than what they have now, which is essentially old Soviet/Russian military equipment. I believe they have the SA-20, I believe. The
Right.
S-300, I believe, is the Russian nomenclature for it. And then also potentially armored vehicles, because China actually has sold them quite a bit, to include the expert version of the ZTD-05, or the Type 05 amphibious assault vehicles that they have. So I can see this as China stepping in and saying, like, you need new defense. new defensive equipment. We want your oil. Hint, 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 hint. We can give you all this if you sign over your resources to us, please.
And of course, this creates massive problems for the US in this theatre of the world as well, with extending of power in and maybe giving the casus belli for China to do this.
No, I agree, because that was one of the main concerns after the whole toss up between India and Pakistan, is that, you know, you've seen how the J-10 actually conducted itself during war. You know, China played it up. I don't know if you were on X on the days after that. The Chinese, you know, nationalist disinformation bots, etc., they had a field day with it, saying that, oh, look, you know, our J-10 defeated the Raphael. Completely ignoring the fact that, you know, in the aftermath, India, you know, launched during its campaign, destroyed, I want to say, at least one HQ-9 battalion and several other pieces of Chinese supplied equipment, air defense equipment. And so you kind of see them try to play this up to where, like, other countries who don't like the United States or don't like buying stuff from the West and are pretty much out of luck buying from anyone else, such as Russia, could say, we want a advanced jet capable of defeating Western counterparts, to include the Raphael and potentially the F-16. China is willing to sell it to us at cheap or on loan, thus intertwining them into one, debt, and then two, diplomatic and military relationships, because you have to make those deals somehow, which is mainly through diplomacy / arms negotiation, and then also military, because you're going to have to learn how to deploy those, deploy the J-10s. I use J-10, but it could be anything, like regarding like tanks or anything. You need to learn how to deploy those, how to utilize those to the greatest extent possible. And China would be the only one that knows how to do it outside of Pakistan. So,
yeah, I've said at length too that you've got these states moving away from the US, and of course with US CATSA restrictions that it will sanction countries if they look at purchasing other equipment. And we see Turkey going through this problem at the moment with their Khan 5th generation fighter aircraft, that America won't sell them the engine of which they're after, and therefore countries look at other players, and especially when you look talking about high efficiency turbine engines, you look towards Russia or China. We've seen similar with Turkey, amongst that was the S-400. We've seen India for air defense systems. You've seen Indonesia under these American restrictions too, that if you look to purchase this system, you could be sanctioned. The problem is this does sort of kneecap you, that you go, well, hang on, you won't sell us a high-end air defense system or an engine, so we're going to look outside and start importing systems, and we're just going to have the pain of your sanctions. And that I do see that China's export market may skyrocket over the coming years or decades as manufacturing in the West massively reduces. So therefore, our ability to export those systems will decrease as we're trying to refill our own used systems. And therefore, that can, this isn't done just as far as, oh yeah, give us $1 million and we'll give you this. It's diplomatically, it's ties, it's resources, and it's tying countries to yourself. So you think that's a fair assessment?
No, it is. It is, Matt, and you put it very well. That they're going to have to look at get these engines from somewhere, get the equipment from somewhere, and if you can't sell them, or United States, let alone Great Britain or France or what have you, isn't willing or can't sell you this because they don't want to run afoul of sanctions from the United States, and Russia can't sell it because, you know, the Ukraine conflict.
Hmm.
Who else is out there? India could barely produce his own. India can barely produce licensed produced engines by itself. It still has to ask for exceptions under Katusa, I believe, uh, under that law that you mentioned,
Hmm.
when they're trying to make deals with Russia. And so realistically, that leaves China, who actually has the capability to produce all these equipment. Yeah, they may not be, you know, quite as high end as the United States and other Western equipment, but they're good enough to where they'll be able to provide them with a modern solution or modern equipment.
Hmm.
And
And en masse too. That's one thing I
yes,
see is I speak about this a little bit with you know, and you're more of an expert on China than myself, but I look and go, look, the China. What I look at is the automotive industry to get an idea of military industry and capability. And I go, look, I understand that a BYD U9 vehicle is not the same level of machining or technology that a Ferrari is, say. But we see Nürburgring times are fairly similar, cost significantly less, and China can produce 80 plus thousand cars a day. That this focus on mass. And my main criticism of the West is, yes, we've got incredibly high-end systems, but these are all technology, therefore super expensive. And Ukraine has showed us that we just can't produce weapons en masse, that we have a country like Russia out producing the West in shells and in tanks, armored vehicles. And so if Russia is out producing that, Russia has nowhere near the capability of China. That I believe that China has gone, we don't really care about these 1%ers of technology. You know, where does our fifth gen fighter sit against their fifth gen fighter in these 1-2% increases or decreases? But what we're going to do is just be able to have that much mass. And that goes down to the idea that's floated around of, as long as China can survive the opening weeks of a war, their manufacturing will eventually win it for them.
no, I will agree. I mean, like, regarding the Russia's ability, their armament industry has essentially cherry pick which entities they can actually supply and produce now, fully indigenously. And so they can do, you know, tanks, armored vehicles. They know how to do that. But some other stuff, you know, like high end, like some types of shells, some types of UAVs, they have to literally ask Iran and North Korea for assistance in that, because, you know, they've ran out of shells. They literally ran out. That was literally one of the key deals, one of the key aspects of the deals that Russia signed with North Korea, is that, hey, we need shells that fit Russian equipment. You're the only one that has mountains of literal mountains of this shit.
Yeah, it was to give a buffer zone or a buffer of that equipment use in those middle years of the war, to pick up their own manufacturing capability.
Exactly.
We did the same though. We were purchasing shells back off Saudi 155s. We had Czech looking for shells wherever they could with their initiatives. That we all of us from the Kremlin through to Brussels through to Washington massively underestimated just the sheer quantity of things like shells that would be required.
No, and I agree, because I think the last 20 years, not only that, but, you know, I would venture to say the Gulf War kind of like made it seem as if, you know, wars will be, you know, swift and brutal and efficient. And then you have, you know, the 20 years of GWAT saying that PGMs are the way to go. And then you have the Ukraine conflict, which it just says, you know, Great War. Anyone?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's just mass.
exactly.
Look, mate, I think, well, we've run way over our initial time, but that is absolutely fine. I could talk to you all day, and I'm sure that you and I will do more regarding China and certain specific situations. Everyone who's listening to this point, please, your link to your page will be in the top pinned comment anyway, so everyone will have seen it. Please go and follow yourself. Please keep in touch. And if you see any holes in my knowledge, please feel free to pull me up on them at any point and come on and add nuance to anything. But mate, where else can people find you other than the Instagram that we've mentioned? Because that's where I've spoken to yourself.
Yeah, so you can find me on X/Twitter, LinkedIn as well, and Blue Sky. You can find me on those platforms as well. You could possibly find me on other publications as well in the future. Just depends upon how the die is cast, if you will. So,
yeah, perfect, mate. Thank you very much. I've massively enjoyed this. It was very eye-opening for myself and my audience. I'm sure we'll get a lot out of this. So thank you very much, man. I know we've done this at a weird time because we're in different time zones, but I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day, mate.
No, thank you, Matt, for extending the invitation to come on your podcast or your show. Forgive me. I really do appreciate it. And yeah, no worries. I understand, man. It's a completely weird time difference zone. So no worries, man.
No, easy. Okay. Thank you very much, mate.
You're welcome, man.